You've probably seen the headline, "Scientists ranked human populations by genetic age. The oldest shocked everyone." But when you dig into the actual research published in Science magazine, the story isn't about ranking races at all. It's about something far more interesting, and the scientists who did the work are explicitly warning people not to misuse their findings the way this headline does. In March 2025, 3 researchers from the University of Michigan published a paper that would become the source of countless viral videos and sensationalized posts across social media. Michael Grundler, Jonathan Terhorst, and Gideon Bradford introduced a new computational method for understanding how human ancestors moved across the globe over hundreds of thousands of years. The work was genuinely innovative, technically sophisticated, and published in one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals called Science, which has been advancing scientific understanding since 1880. The study represented years of methodological development and careful analysis, building on decades of previous research in population genetics and human demographic history. But somewhere between the peer-reviewed paper and the viral content, the story got completely inverted, twisted beyond recognition by the time it reached millions of people on social media platforms. The original study is titled "A Geographic History of Human Genetic Ancestry." The method capitalizes on genealogical information encoded in what researchers call genomic tree sequences to infer the geographic locations of shared ancestors. Think of it like this. Your DNA contains information about where your ancestors lived, not just who they were. By analyzing these genetic trees at scale across hundreds of samples from Europe, Asia, and Africa, the researchers could map out the probable migration routes humans took over deep time. They could say, with some confidence, that certain populations likely came from northern routes out of Africa, rather than southern ones, or trace how populations moved across Eurasia in patterns that match the archaeological and historical record. This is genuinely valuable science. Understanding human migration patterns helps us understand genetic variation, disease susceptibility, and the demographic history of our species. It's the kind of foundational work that other researchers build on for decades, generating new insights into how populations adapted to different environments, how diseases spread, and how human diversity emerged. But it also contains a direct, unambiguous warning that makes the viral headline even more puzzling. The authors write, "Genetic variation in humans is often summarized with discrete geographic labels, but these can be inaccurate and misleading." Later, they state that their findings caution against the oversimplified interpretations of genetic data prevalent in contemporary discussions of race and ancestry. This wasn't a throwaway sentence buried in a footnote. It's central to their argument about what their research actually means. The researchers didn't rank populations by genetic age. They didn't measure DNA age at all. They traced migration patterns through time and space using a mathematical model of ancestry rooted in population genetics. When they talk about something being older or younger, they're talking about when a migration event likely occurred in the past, not the biological age of any living population today. This is an absolutely crucial distinction that the viral headline completely obscures. A population with ancestors who migrated from Africa 60,000 years ago isn't older as a genetic entity than a population with ancestors who migrated 10,000 years ago. That would be a fundamental misunderstanding of how genetics works. The concept of DNA age for populations doesn't exist in serious genetics, yet this is exactly the confusion the viral headline creates, taking a temporal marker for ancestral movement and twisting it into a ranking of modern populations. To understand why this matters, we need to step back and look at what actually happened in the history of science when researchers tried to rank human populations. The story is darker than most people realize. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, scientists genuinely believed they could rank races by various measures. Phrenologists measured skull sizes and claimed they could determine intelligence and capability from brain volume. Physical anthropologists analyzed blood types and other markers, constructing elaborate hierarchies of human worth. And later, when DNA became available, researchers looked for genetic markers they claimed could sort humans into distinct biological categories with varying levels of advancement. Most of this research was terrible science wrapped in the language of objectivity, but it had real consequences. It provided the intellectual ammunition for eugenics movements, for justifications of colonialism, for Nazi racial ideology that led to genocide. When you allow science to be used as a tool for ranking human groups, the results have historically been catastrophic. This is why modern population geneticists are so emphatic about a particular point. Human genetic variation does not cluster neatly into racial categories. This isn't a political stance. It's what 70 years of genetic research actually shows. In 2021, a study examining over 11,000 papers published between 1949 and 2018 found that the term race appeared in only 5% of genetics papers published in the most recent decade, down from 22% in the first decade of the study period. Geneticists have largely abandoned racial categories not because of political pressure, but because the data doesn't support them. When you look at the genetic variation within supposed racial groups, it's often larger than variation between groups. This is one of the most important facts in population genetics, and it fundamentally contradicts the idea that races are genetically distinct. A person of European descent and a person of East Asian descent might be more genetically similar to each other than either one is to someone else from their own supposed racial group. Geography matters for human genetics. Variation, but geography is a continuum, not a series of discrete boxes. There's genetic diversity within Africa, greater than the genetic diversity between Africa and all other continents combined. This finding, replicated across numerous studies and data sets, shows that the concept of race simply doesn't map onto genetic reality. This is what the Grundler study demonstrates, that if you want to understand human genetic variation, you need to think about it geographically and temporally, accounting for actual migration history and demographic processes, not as a series of racial categories that treat geography as a discrete variable. The viral headline takes this research and inverts it almost completely. It implies that researchers have created a ranking of racial groups by some measure called DNA age, with a shocking result that everyone was surprised by. This framing does several rhetorical things at once. It suggests that races are comparable units that can be ranked. It suggests that scientific authority backs this ranking. It suggests that there's something surprising or counterintuitive about the results, which implies that if you knew the rankings, you might draw conclusions about which populations are superior or inferior, older or younger, as biological entities. None of this has any basis in what the researchers actually found. What Grundler, Terhorst, and Bradford actually did was use genomic data from modern populations to infer the paths their ancestors likely took when migrating across continents. They modeled these paths using a technique called migration cost functions, essentially asking, if I know where this person's ancestors are today, and I know roughly when they left Africa, what route through geography would have been most plausible? The researchers predicted the least costly migration paths for their sampled individuals going back through 200,000 years. They found that the most likely path out of Africa was a northern route, consistent with archaeological evidence that human populations moved through the Middle East and into Europe, rather than taking a southern coastal path. This finding is interesting because it matches what we already knew from archaeology, which is how you know the method is working correctly. When a new analytical technique produces results consistent with independent evidence, that's a sign you're on the right track. But it also shows how the method is fundamentally different from ranking. The researchers aren't saying that European populations are older than African populations, or African populations older than Asian populations. They're saying that the genetic ancestors of the European samples in their study probably took a northern migration route during certain periods of human prehistory. The geographic locations of sampled modern-day genomes are treated as endpoints, with the analysis working backward through time to infer where their ancestors were. The broader context here is crucial. In 2024 and 2025, multiple major studies were released examining the relationship between race, ethnicity, and genetic ancestry. A massive NIH study using data from the All of Us research program found that self-identified race is a poor proxy for genetic ancestry. People in the same racial or ethnic category showed significant genetic variation across different U.S. states, reflecting the historical impacts of U.S. colonization, the transatlantic slave trade, and recent migrations. The research also found that race and genetics simply don't line up well, despite what viral headlines might suggest. Jed Carlson, a population geneticist at the University of Michigan who studies how population genetics data is used in right-wing circles, made an observation about how this kind of research gets misinterpreted. He noted that while the Grundler paper doesn't mince words in its recommendation to scientists, how it gets interpreted by the general public is much harder to pin down. He also noted that the paper seems to be shared frequently in conservative spaces, often with captions that twist the findings into something they don't support. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine have issued formal guidance on this problem. In 2024, editors across several major biomedical and genetics journals issued joint guidance advising that self-identified race and ethnicity should not be used as proxies for genetic ancestry groups. If researchers want to use any population descriptors, those must be carefully justified in the methods section. This guidance exists precisely because of the long history of misinterpreting genetic data as support for racial hierarchies. To understand why this matters, consider what happens when genetic research gets packaged as support for racial ranking. There's a pattern that repeats throughout scientific history. A paper is published that describes genetic variation among populations. The paper includes careful caveats about what the data does and doesn't show. Someone else reads that paper and decides it supports their pre-existing beliefs about human differences. They extract a single finding, remove it from context, and present it as proof that some racial groups are genetically superior to others. By the time it reaches social media, the original research has been transformed into something its authors would barely recognize. This has happened before, most dramatically with the Human Genome Diversity Cell Line panel, a collection of genetic samples from people around the world. When data from this panel was published in 2002, it was used to suggest genetic clusters that corresponded roughly to racial groups. But the researchers who created it, including Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza, were very careful to note that the clusters didn't map onto racial categories in any meaningful way. The patterns observed were the result of geographic isolation over time, not evidence of discrete biological races. Yet the findings were widely reported as proof that human races were genetically distinct. When you read the paper itself versus when you read popular accounts of the paper, you're reading about two different things. The Grundler study includes explicit language designed to prevent this kind of misuse. The authors write, "In humans, traditional approaches for describing population genetic variation often rely on discrete genetic ancestry labels, which, despite their utility, can obscure the complex, multifaceted nature of human genetic history. These labels risk oversimplifying ancestry by ignoring its temporal depth and geographic continuity, and may therefore conflate notions of race, ethnicity, geography, and genetic ancestry." This is about as direct as you can get. They're saying that the way people talk about race and genetics is fundamentally misleading, and their work demonstrates why. What the study actually contributes is methodological innovation that will have long-term significance in the field. Grundler, Terhorst, and Bradford developed a better way to infer where human ancestors likely lived in the past based on present-day genetic variation. This kind of methodological advance matters because it enables better science in the future, opening new research directions that weren't possible before. Other researchers can use this tool to ask more refined questions about human demographic history, about how populations moved, mixed, and adapted to new environments. The technique could apply to other species as well, making it broadly useful across evolutionary biology. The authors suggest it might provide an alternate way to account for shared ancestry in genetic studies, which could improve genome-wide association studies and the identification of loci involved in local adaptation and disease risk. These are the actually significant contributions of the work, contributions that will ripple through the field for years to come. This is the fundamental problem we're facing in science communication today. We live in an era where scientific findings can be inverted almost instantly and spread to millions of people before the scientists themselves know it's happened. Grundler, Terhorst, and Bradford published their work in March 2025. Within weeks, viral videos were circulating, claiming they had ranked human populations by genetic age. The researchers had included careful warnings against exactly this kind of interpretation. It didn't matter. The public-facing narrative had already crystallized into something false, and that false narrative stuck around, spreading far beyond the reach of any correction the authors might have offered. This is the power and danger of social media amplification of misinformation. What makes this situation particularly frustrating is that the real science is genuinely interesting. Understanding how human ancestors migrated across continents over hundreds of thousands of years is fascinating. Developing new methods to infer geographic ancestry from genomic data is innovative. The finding that the most likely path out of Africa was northern rather than southern matters for understanding the human story. But none of that makes it into the viral headline because none of that is sensational enough. The history of population genetics includes cautionary tales about what happens when research gets misrepresented. In the 1990s, there was significant controversy around the idea that genetic structure in humans mapped onto racial categories. Some researchers, most notably Noah Rosenberg and colleagues, published work using cluster analysis that seemed to show that human genetic variation sorted into distinct groups that matched up with geographical regions. The paper itself was careful about what conclusions to draw from this finding. The researchers explicitly stated that the clusters shouldn't be interpreted as biological races. But in popular accounts, and in some scientific contexts, this work was cited as evidence that races were genetically real. By then, the message had separated from the method. What Rosenberg actually showed was that if you take genetic data from people from different continents and apply clustering algorithms, you get geographic clusters. This is not surprising. You live on a continent, you're probably genetically similar to other people who live on that continent. Geography creates patterns in genetic variation. That's not the same as saying races are biological entities. The broader scientific consensus is very clear on this point. The vast majority of population geneticists do not believe that human races are distinct biological categories that can be ranked or compared in any meaningful way. They understand human genetic variation as continuous and multidimensional, strongly shaped by geography and migration history, but not organized into the discrete boxes that race implies. This consensus emerged from actual data, from the repeated finding that genetic variation within groups is often larger than variation between groups, from the observation that genetic ancestry doesn't predict the racial categories people use to describe themselves, from decades of work demonstrating that traditional racial categories are social constructs, not biological realities. Yet every few years, a new viral headline emerges claiming that scientists have finally proven racial differences are genetic. Sometimes it's about IQ, sometimes it's about athletic ability, sometimes it's about disease susceptibility. And each time when you dig into the actual research, you find that the study either doesn't support the headline or explicitly warns against exactly this kind of interpretation. It's become a predictable pattern. The sensationalized version spreads widely and sticks in people's minds. The correction reaches a tiny fraction of the audience that saw the original claim. And the overall effect is that public understanding of genetics becomes more distorted, not less. The Grundler study provides a case study in how this happens. The research itself is solid. It's published in a top journal. It's methodologically sound and makes a genuine contribution to the field. The authors clearly state that their work supports thinking about human genetic variation in geographic and temporal terms rather than racial categories. And yet, within weeks, it's being presented as evidence for the exact opposite position. This gap between what research actually shows and how it gets communicated is one of the most persistent problems in science communication today. There are institutional reasons for this problem rooted in how modern science and media operate. Scientists are evaluated based on citations and impact. A study that gets discussed widely, even in distorted ways, looks good in that metric. Journals want attention and publicity for their brand. Publishers want bestsellers and viral content that drives revenue. News outlets want clicks and engagement that translate to advertising dollars. Social media platforms reward engagement above all else, not accuracy or truthfulness. All of these incentives align to favor sensational misinterpretations over careful, accurate communication of actual findings. The researchers who did the work often have limited ability to correct the record once the false narrative has taken hold and spread widely. What should happen is clear. When someone sees a headline claiming that scientists have ranked human races by genetic age, they should go find the actual paper and read it. Not the abstract, not the news coverage, but the actual text written by the researchers. They should look for what the authors actually claim versus what they're being reported as claiming. They should pay attention to the limitation section, where researchers explain what their work doesn't show. In the case of the Grundler study, reading the actual paper makes it immediately obvious that the viral headline is false. The researchers explicitly caution against oversimplified interpretations of genetic data in discussions of race and ancestry. Their work is about geographic history of human genetic ancestry, not about ranking races. But most people don't read the actual paper. Most people see the headline, read maybe the first paragraph of a summary, and form an opinion. By the time they've done that, they've often already made up their minds about what they think the research shows. This is why viral misinformation about genetics is so persistent and so dangerous. It doesn't just misinform people about what a particular study shows, it reinforces broader misconceptions about the relationship between genetics and race, about whether humans can be neatly categorized into biological groups, about whether genetic differences might justify differential treatment of different populations. These misconceptions matter because they have real-world consequences. If people believe that genetic research supports racial hierarchies, they may support discriminatory policies. They may view certain groups as biologically inferior or superior. They may reject evidence about systemic inequality because they think differences between groups are primarily genetic. The pseudoscientific racism that emerged from distorted genetics research has been used to justify everything from forced sterilization to immigration restrictions to police profiling. When viral headlines misrepresent genetic research as supporting racial differences, they're not just spreading false information. They're creating conditions in which discriminatory thinking seems scientifically justified. The scientific community has been trying to address this problem for decades. In 1972, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists issued a statement declaring that there was no scientific basis for racial classifications. In 1998, the American Anthropological Association stated that races could not be categorized by any combination of physical or genetic characteristics. In 2019, researchers published a paper explicitly titled, "Human Races Are Not Like Dog Breeds," refuting a racist analogy, pushing back against claims that human genetic variation justified dividing people into discrete races the way we do with dog breeds. The problem is that these statements, made in academic journals and professional meetings, reach relatively few people compared to viral videos claiming scientists have ranked races by genetic age. What we're seeing with the Grundler study is a clash between different ways of communicating science. In the academic context, researchers present findings with careful qualifications, limitations, statistical uncertainty, and attention to how their work fits into the broader literature and previous research. In the public context, everything gets simplified down to a single claim, usually presented as shocking or surprising. The more shocking and surprising the claim, the more likely it is to spread across social networks and reach a massive audience. This creates a perverse incentive structure where the most misleading possible interpretation of a study is the one most likely to become widely known and believed by the public. The response to this problem needs to be multifaceted. Scientists need to communicate more effectively with the public about what their research does and doesn't show, but they're not trained to do this and often lack the incentive to try. Journalists need to do better at reading actual papers rather than relying on press releases, but many news outlets lack the expertise to evaluate. Technical scientific claims. Social media platforms need to take responsibility for what spreads on their services, but they've so far shown little willingness to do so. And the public needs to develop better critical thinking about scientific claims, which is easier said than done when misinformation is designed specifically to be believed. In the case of the Grundler study, the situation is particularly clear-cut because the authors were explicit in warning against exactly the misinterpretation that went viral. They didn't just fail to mention the risk of misuse, they directly addressed it, stating that oversimplified interpretations of genetic data are prevalent in contemporary discussions of race and ancestry, and that these interpretations are fundamentally misleading. A sophisticated reader of the actual paper would have no doubt that it does not support ranking races by genetic age, but most people will never read the actual paper. They'll see the viral headline, maybe skim a summary, and that will become their understanding of what the research shows, for better or worse. This brings us to the broader question. What should we understand about the relationship between genetics and race based on the current state of scientific knowledge? The answer is straightforward, even if it contradicts much of what circulates on social media. Humans show genetic variation, but this variation is distributed continuously across geography rather than clustering into discrete races. Self-identified race is a social category, not a biological one. Genetic ancestry and race don't correlate tightly with each other. Race is historically contingent, varying across time and cultures. Human genetic variation shows greater diversity within continents than between them. And most importantly, even where there are statistical differences in the frequency of genetic variance between populations, these differences are tiny compared to the overall genetic similarity between all humans and don't support any hierarchical ranking of groups. The Grundler study, when read accurately, actually reinforces these points. By showing how human ancestors moved across geography over time, it demonstrates that genetic variation is tied to migration and geography, not to race. By developing a method that must account for temporal depth and geographic continuity, it shows why discrete racial categories are misleading. By explicitly warning against oversimplified interpretations, it signals that even research focused on geographic ancestry can be misused to support false claims about racial differences. Understanding what actually happened with this study is important, not just for the sake of getting the facts right, though that matters. It's important because it shows us how misinformation about genetics spreads, how scientific findings get inverted when they move from academic to public contexts, and how pre-existing beliefs about race can shape how we interpret data. The next time you see a viral headline about genetic research proving something about human differences, you now have a framework for thinking critically about it. Go find the actual paper. Read what the researchers actually claim. Look for their caveats and limitations. Ask yourself whether the viral headline could possibly be consistent with what the researchers actually found. More often than not, you'll discover that the truth is much less sensational than the headline suggests, but also much more interesting if you take the time to understand it.